The day Will and Sarah moved into Meadowbrook Estates, the wind carried more than just spring pollen. It whispered of trouble. The house was perfect. A 2-story with wraparound porch, oak trees lining the backyard, and a wide fenced pasture just beyond the property line. For most people, it was a patch of unused land. For Will, it was Baxter's new home. Baxter, a massive Highland bull with shaggy cinnamon-colored fur and curling horns, wasn't just a pet, he was family. Calm, slow-moving, and oddly dignified. He had the temperament of a sleepy Labrador and the body of a tank. Will had raised him on his uncle's ranch, and when city stress became too much, Baxter became part of their escape plan. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the livestock trailer backed into the drive. Some took pictures. Others whispered. But one figure stood motionless on the opposite side of the cul-de-sac, a woman in a pale blue blouse, arms folded tightly, lips pressed into a flat, colorless line. Her bleach blonde bob didn't move in the wind, but her eyes followed every step Baxter took. Karen Whitmore. Will didn't know her name yet, but he felt the weight of her stare. That night, Sarah found the note. It wasn't folded, just a half sheet of printer paper slipped under the front door. No name, no greeting. Just, "This isn't a farm. It's a community." Sarah blinked. Who even writes stuff like this? Will chuckled at first. Probably just someone surprised to see a bull. It'll blow over. But it didn't. The next morning, another note appeared, taped to the mailbox this time. Section 4.3. No livestock on residential property. It was typed. Precise. Almost surgical. Will scanned the HOA handbook and found the line. But it didn't apply. Their home backed onto a mixed-zoned buffer lot. Technically, Baxter was within bounds. Legally. But Karen didn't care about technicalities. She cared about control. Over the next few days, things got strange. One afternoon, Sarah spotted Karen across the street, measuring the fence with what looked like a laser level. Another time, Will caught her crouching behind her mailbox, snapping photos with a telephoto lens. When their trash bin mysteriously vanished, they suspected a prank. Until a neighbor casually mentioned Karen had spoken of wild animal attractants. Then came the HOA complaint. Official letterhead. Multiple pages. Still, the board dismissed it. Everything Will had done was within code. Baxter was healthy, vaccinated, and quieter than most people's dogs. The neighborhood, aside from Karen, had warmed up. Kids waved at Baxter. A retiree even painted him into a watercolor of the park. But Will could feel something brewing. There was a coldness in Karen's eyes. Less annoyance, more obsession. The kind of focus you see before a chess player sacrifices their queen. And one night, as the wind picked up again, Will noticed something. The faint scent of sawdust, coming from the fence line. Karen Whitmore didn't just live in Meadowbrook Estates, she ruled it. Her house, perched on the corner like a throne at the edge of a chessboard, was a display of obsessive order. White shutters scrubbed to a shine. Garden gnomes aligned like soldiers. Not a blade of grass out of place. Her security lights turned on at exactly 7:02 every evening. She didn't own a dog, because barking disrupts harmony. She once fined a family for hanging a beach towel on their balcony. To the rest of the neighborhood, Karen wasn't a person. She was a force of nature wrapped in pastel cashmere. And now, Karen had a target. Every day, she escalated. On Monday, Will found a printed HOA bylaw taped to his trash can. On Tuesday, a petition, obviously authored by Karen, circulated calling for the removal of disruptive livestock. Only 2 neighbors signed it. Karen and her equally bitter friend, Doris, who spent her days yelling at teenagers for walking too loudly. By Wednesday, things turned darker. A rock was tossed into Will's yard, wrapped in a note that read, "Animals belong in barns, not near homes." No signature. Just a thin smear of red lipstick on the corner, the kind Karen wore. Sarah wanted to confront her. Will hesitated. "She wants a fight," he said quietly, watching Baxter graze peacefully near the fence. "We don't give her one." But Karen wasn't waiting. That night, Will was out back when he heard it, a distinct click. He turned to see a camera flash through Karen's window, trained directly on Baxter. The next morning, he received an email with a blurry image attached. Karen had tracked down his HOA file and was now alleging zoning discrepancies, noise violations, and threats to domestic tranquility. Will read it twice. The phrasing was surgical, lawyerly, like she'd been planning it for weeks. He forwarded it to the HOA board. Again, they dismissed her claims, but that only seemed to embolden her. The very next day, a delivery truck pulled up in front of Karen's home. Out came several large boxes marked Security System, cameras, floodlights, motion detectors. Within hours, her front lawn looked like the entrance to a government facility. One neighbor joked, "What's she watching for? The bull uprising." But Will wasn't laughing. Because that night, just before midnight, the camera he quietly installed above the back gate blinked to life. Motion detected. A figure moved through the shadows, deliberate, crouching low, holding something in one hand that gleamed in the moonlight, a hacksaw. Will froze as he watched the live feed. The figure wore slippers, a pale blue bathrobe. Her hair was tucked under a hoodie, but the face, briefly caught in the glare, was unmistakable. Karen Whitmore was at his fence, and she was cutting through it. Will's breath caught as he leaned closer to the monitor. The camera feed flickered, grainy but clear enough to confirm his worst fear. Karen was kneeling at the fence line, methodically sawing through the boards with steady hands. The teeth of the hacksaw scraped wood with a sickening rhythm. Back forth, back forth. She paused only to glance around, then continued her work like a woman possessed. He didn't wake Sarah. Not yet. Instead, he watched as she cut through one board, then another, then a third. Each one separated like it had been pre-measured. She wasn't guessing. She had planned this. She moved with chilling precision, as if she'd rehearsed the angle, the force, the timing. Will's hand hovered over his phone, torn between calling the police or confronting her himself. But something made him hesitate. Curiosity, caution, a desire to understand how far she'd go. When Karen stood up, she didn't run. She simply wiped her hands with a tissue, tucked the saw into a cloth grocery bag, and casually walked back across the street, into the shadows of her fortress of order. The next morning, Will didn't need the camera to tell them what had happened. 3 slats of his back fence were missing, cut clean, like surgical incisions. The gap they left was just wide enough for Baxter to pass through. But the bull wasn't in the yard. He was gone. "Baxter," Will called, scanning the pasture. Silence. A sinking feeling gripped his stomach. Sarah joined him moments later, still in her robe. Her face drained of color when she saw the gap. "Where is he?" Will followed the trail of hoofprints in the damp grass. They curved slightly, then veered straight across the property line, through the opening, across the lawn, directly toward Karen's house. They ran. Will and Sarah rounded the side of Karen's house just in time to hear her scream. A loud, shrill, operatic screech echoed down the street. Karen was standing on her patio furniture, barefoot, arms flailing, as Baxter stood calmly in her prized rose garden, chewing contentedly on her award-winning blooms. "No, no, you monster. Get out of there," she shrieked, hurling a potted plant at him. It bounced off his thick hide with a thud, barely acknowledged. Will froze. The moment was too surreal to process. Baxter, the most peaceful creature he knew, stood like a shaggy sentinel of justice in a battlefield of crushed azaleas and mangled hedges. Karen, drenched from her own sprinkler system, screamed obscenities that no HOA handbook could justify. Will did the only thing he could think of. He pulled out his phone and hit record. The video began with Karen yelling, "I knew you'd use that thing as a weapon," and cut to Baxter calmly licking a lawn gnome as if tasting his victory. Will said nothing. He didn't have to. Because the moment the internet saw this, the game was no longer about fence violations. It was about who would pay the price for crossing the line. The video exploded online like dry tinder meeting flame. Within hours of posting, it had racked up thousands of shares. By morning, it was on 3 neighborhood forums, a Reddit thread titled Karen vs. Highland Bull, Guess Who Won? And even caught the attention of a local news outlet. But the real fire was about to start. Karen tried to control the narrative. She marched down to the HOA office at 8 a.m. sharp, still damp from her impromptu koi pond dive, demanding action. She waved a printed still of Baxter standing on her hydrangeas like it was a police mugshot. This is livestock aggression. This is a threat to public safety, she cried. The HOA board, half amused, half exhausted, asked her to sit down. Then Will entered the room with his evidence. He didn't just have the video of the Rose Garden incident. He had the footage. The grainy black and white clip of Karen, at 3:47 a.m., hacking away at his fence like a rogue lumberjack. The audio was faint, but clear enough to hear her muttering, "Let's see the board ignore me now." When Will pressed play, silence gripped the room. Even Karen stopped talking. The camera showed her dropping the saw, stepping through the opening, and standing for just a second, staring into the pasture. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She wanted this to happen. She had orchestrated it. This wasn't negligence, Will said evenly, voice steady. This was sabotage. Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping for air. I was protecting the neighborhood. But the room had already turned cold. The HOA president, a stern former Navy officer named Jim, took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Karen, you cut a resident's fence, trespassed, caused the escape of a 1-ton animal, and you filmed it. That's not how it happened, she snapped. Will tapped his phone. The footage began again. Her face, illuminated in the night vision glow, was unmistakable. Jim turned to her slowly. You're suspended from all HOA duties effective immediately. A vote for removal will follow. And I suggest you prepare for civil action. Karen looked like she'd been slapped. Her hands trembled at her sides. She opened her mouth to scream, but stopped. The realization had set in. The very thing she thought would prove her power had become the rope that tied the noose. She turned and stormed out without a word. Will stayed behind, leaving the board a copy of the footage. But before he left, he paused and turned back. One more thing, he said. You might want to check the bylaws again. It says no livestock that disrupts community peace. Baxter never made a sound. Then he walked out. Outside, he checked his phone again. The video now had over 1 million views. Comments poured in. This bull is my spirit animal. Justice served, farm style. Petition to make Baxter president of the HOA. But nestled between the memes and jokes was a private message. From an anonymous user. She's not finished. Will reread the anonymous message 3 times. She's not finished. No name. No profile photo. No replies. Just that chilling sentence sitting in his inbox like a coiled snake, waiting to strike. He showed it to Sarah. Her response was immediate. She's going to do something worse, she said, eyes narrowing. Cutting the fence was just the warning shot. By the end of that day, the HOA voted Karen out unanimously. She was stripped of her position, barred from board meetings, and issued an official cease and desist. The neighborhood sighed in collective relief. But Karen didn't. She vanished from view, but not from presence. The next morning, a neighbor found their tires slashed. Another discovered eggs splattered on their garage door. A single mailbox was stuffed with decaying roses and a typed message that read, "Cows come and go. Some stink never leaves." Will beefed up his security. More cameras, motion lights, reinforced locks. But still, the feeling crept in. That itching sense that eyes were always watching from behind curtains. That Baxter's calm grazing was no longer the peaceful backdrop of country life. It was bait. And the predator wasn't done hunting. 2 nights later, it happened. A scream pierced the cul-de-sac like a knife through glass. Will bolted upright. Sarah was already out of bed, throwing on her robe. They rushed outside and froze at the sight in Karen's front yard. Chaos. A full sprinkler system had erupted in the middle of the night, soaking everything. Karen stood barefoot on a tipped-over bench, screeching at the top of her lungs. And in the middle of it all, as serene as a mountain god, stood Baxter. He had escaped again, through the same weak point in the fence. Will had fixed it, but not fortified it. Someone had loosened the boards just enough. Someone wanted this. Karen pointed a shaking finger. You trained him. You sick freak. You trained him to attack my roses. Baxter, completely unfazed, sniffed a nearby birdbath and sneezed. The blast knocked a ceramic frog clean off its edge. That bull is a weapon. Karen screamed, now soaked to the bone, mascara streaking down her face. She grabbed her garden hose and unleashed it full blast, directly into Baxter's face. Baxter blinked, then, very slowly, stepped forward. The hose slipped from her hands. Karen backpedaled, right into her koi pond. The splash was so loud it startled 2 porch lights on. She emerged seconds later, spluttering, soaked, and wild-eyed. The neighbors had started to gather. Phones were out. Cameras recording. Flashlights trained on her like stage spotlights. Sarah whispered to Will, "This is it. She's unraveling." Karen tried to stand, but slipped on the mossy edge and landed again with a splash. Baxter, meanwhile, gently headbutted a garden gnome, sending it spinning like a top. He mooed once, loud, long, and echoing down the street like a war horn. And in that moment, something snapped in Karen's face. She looked around, realized everyone was watching, not supporting, witnessing. And Will was smiling. The bull had broken the roses, but she had broken herself. By dawn, the footage was everywhere. Karen's midnight meltdown, pond plunge and all, hit the internet like a storm front. One video alone had over 5 million views in 12 hours. The hashtags began trending before breakfast. Bull Justice, Carmen Koi Pond, Karen vs. Baxter. TikTok teens added dramatic music overlays. Twitter lit up with memes comparing Karen's scream to a haunted goose. Even a national morning show replayed the clip with a slow-motion zoom of Baxter's heroic garden destruction, complete with a triumphant brass soundtrack. And Baxter, the bull, was now a celebrity. He had a fan page, an Instagram account with 200 followers, and someone had already printed a t-shirt featuring him stomping through roses with the words, "Mess with the bull," in bold red letters. But while the world laughed, Karen seethed. She didn't come outside for 2 days. Her windows stayed shuttered, security lights flashing at the slightest movement. The pristine order of her lawn began to slip. Mail piling up, hedges untrimmed, a pink flamingo figurine lying sideways as if even it had given up. Will didn't gloat much, but he noticed something odd. Baxter had been restless. He paced near the same spot in the fence every evening, ears twitching. At first, Will thought it was just memory. After all, the fence had been tampered with before. But when he inspected the area again, his stomach dropped. The nails in the lower boards were missing. Not loose. Gone. And buried in the soft soil beneath, a small glittering shard of pink-tinted plastic, Karen's signature gardening glove. Torn, half buried like a discarded secret. "She's planning something," Will muttered. Sarah agreed. "She's quiet now, but that's when it's most dangerous. She's cornered." And cornered people lash out. The next morning, an official letter arrived. Certified mail. It wasn't from the HOA. It was a lawsuit notice. Karen was suing Will for emotional distress, property damage, and endangerment. "She's trying to bankrupt us," Sarah whispered, hands shaking. But it didn't stop there. Later that day, a man in a crisp suit knocked on Will's door. He introduced himself as Ethan Grady, an investigative journalist. "Sorry to barge in, but would you be willing to talk?" he asked, flipping open a notepad. "I've been following the story, and there's chatter that this Karen Whitmore has a history. Complaints, threats, even a sealed case from another neighborhood." Will blinked. "You're saying this isn't the first time?" Ethan nodded. "It's just the first time she picked the wrong bull." Will let him in. But as they sat at the kitchen table, Baxter mooed loudly from outside. 3 sharp bursts, unlike his usual tone. Will glanced toward the window. Something was wrong. Smoke. Thin, curling smoke rising from the edge of the pasture, near the old shed. Will stood so fast his chair toppled. Sarah screamed from the hallway. Because whatever game Karen was playing, she had just raised the stakes. And this time, it wasn't a fence she was cutting. It was fire. Will's heart slammed in his chest as he sprinted toward the pasture, Sarah at his heels. The smoke thickened with every step, curling into the early morning air like some twisted omen. It was coming from the old shed, an abandoned structure tucked in the farthest corner of the yard, once used for storing gardening tools and firewood. Over the years, it had become a forgotten relic. Until now. "Baxter," Will shouted, his voice cracking. But there was no answer, only the crackle of fire. As they neared the shed, Will's stomach churned. He could hear the unmistakable sound of hooves, a frantic thudding, mixed with the soft, disorienting creak of wood under stress. Then came the faintest snort, a bull trying to escape. Will rounded the corner, nearly tripping over the overgrown ivy. And there it was. The shed was on fire. Flickering orange and yellow tongues of flame licked the walls. The roof groaned as the fire spread, but it wasn't just any fire. It was controlled, deliberate. Someone had set it up to burn, just enough to trap Baxter inside. But why? "Baxter!" Sarah screamed again, tears streaking down her face. Will's pulse raced as he tore toward the shed, frantically assessing the situation. The smoke was too thick to go in, but the barn doors were still half open, only a few planks of wood standing in the way. Will pushed his shoulder against the door and forced it open with a groan. The sight inside stopped him cold. Baxter stood at the back of the shed, his massive body blocking the corner as he stared at the inferno, eyes wide with panic. But what truly froze Will's blood wasn't the smoke or the fire. It was the sight of the thin, metal wire tangled around the bull's hooves. Someone had tied Baxter up, intentionally, and left him to burn. Sarah gasped beside him, clutching her chest. "Who would?" Before she could finish, Will was already moving, rushing to Baxter's side. He knelt and began hacking at the wire with a rusted gardening tool. The heat pressed in from every direction, and the smoke stung his eyes. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. "Almost there, buddy. Hold on," Will muttered under his breath. But the sound of footsteps made him freeze. Slowly he turned. A figure stood in the doorframe, backlit by the fire, hands planted firmly on her hips. Karen Whitmore. Her bleach blonde hair was perfect, despite the chaos. She stood there, drenched in sweat, eyes burning with a manic light. "You think you can just ruin my life?" Karen spat, her voice calm but laced with fury. "Do you think this is a game?" Will stood up, his chest heaving. Baxter finally free from the wire. "What the hell did you do, Karen? Why?" "I gave you a chance to comply," Karen's voice lowered to a dangerous hiss. "To follow the rules, to make peace. But you used him, didn't you? You turned my own HOA against me, made me a joke. You all think you can just trample over me. But I'm not done." The fire crackled behind her as she advanced, her eyes wild. "Everything you've ever loved can be destroyed," Karen whispered, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "One match at a time." And then she did it. With a single motion, Karen reached into her pocket and pulled out a lighter. She flicked it once, twice, and the flame shot to life. "Get away from him!" Sarah yelled, but it was too late. The fire roared louder, like an animal breaking free of its cage. Karen flicked the lighter again, letting it fall to the ground, just inches from a pile of dry hay. Will dove toward the lighter, but he was too slow. A second explosion of heat blasted through the shed. The flames surged, catching the dry hay, the wood, everything. The inferno exploded like a beast unleashed. The world seemed to slow. Time itself buckled under the weight of the explosion that followed the flick of Karen's lighter. Flames erupted around them, the heat unbearable. Will's heart slammed against his ribs as he threw himself toward the wall of the shed, grabbing Baxter by the horns and pulling him toward the door. The bull's eyes were wide with confusion, but there was no time to explain. "Come on, buddy, come on," Will shouted, pushing with all his strength. The smoke was suffocating, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and hay. Every breath felt like fire in his lungs. Sarah screamed from behind him, her voice cracking as she staggered to the door. She wasn't going to make it out in time. The shed was collapsing in on itself. Boom! The explosion was deafening. The shed groaned under the pressure as the flames reached up, licking the sky, and chunks of burning debris rained down. The world was chaos. Will was yanked back by the force of the blast, crashing into the dirt with Baxter on top of him. His vision swam, his ears ringing from the blast. For a second, he thought he was dead. But then, there was movement. Baxter, still alive, still breathing, still there. Come on, get up," Will grunted, pushing the bull off of him. He scrambled to his feet, his body aching, the heat still pulsing through the air like a living thing. Sarah, his thoughts flashed to her. He turned toward the door, heart in his throat. She was still there, stumbling toward the exit, her face pale with fear, but she was too far. And then, something shifted in the smoke. Out of the haze, Karen appeared. She was standing at the back of the shed, laughing. The sound was sickening, a twisted cackle that rattled Will to his core. Her clothes were singed, her face covered in ash, but she didn't look frightened. She looked elated. "You think you can stop me?" Karen shouted over the roaring fire, her voice wild with madness. "You think you can win? I was never going to lose. You just didn't see the bigger picture." She turned toward the blazing inferno and spread her arms wide, as if embracing it. Will's blood ran cold. She wasn't just crazy. She was insane. She wanted everything to burn. Will started, but he couldn't finish. There was no time. No words that could fix this. Then, with a sudden burst of adrenaline, Will ran toward her. But it wasn't enough. The fire was spreading too quickly. The foundation of the shed cracked, sending another wave of heat that pushed him back. "Sarah!" Will screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the flames. He didn't know if she had made it out. He didn't know if he could make it out. In that instant, something shifted in the smoke. It wasn't just Karen standing there anymore. Baxter charged through the fire. The bull's powerful hooves pounded the dirt as he barreled straight toward the burning structure. His massive frame cut through the smoke like a bulldozer, and he smashed through the back wall of the shed, sending Karen tumbling to the ground. In a single furious motion, Baxter pinned Karen under his weight, the bull's sheer mass and power enough to subdue her. She struggled, but the flames were closing in, and she couldn't escape. Karen's screams were drowned by the crackling of the fire, but it was too late. The flames surged forward, overtaking everything. Will reached for Sarah, pulling her back just in time as the fire threatened to swallow them both. They watched as the blaze consumed the shed completely, the last remnants of Karen's insane plot reduced to ash and smoke. It was over. Baxter, ever the calm beast, trotted away from the wreckage, his coat covered in soot but unharmed. Will breathed a sigh of relief. Sarah collapsed beside him, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "We're alive," she whispered as though trying to convince herself. Will didn't answer immediately. His gaze locked on the charred remains of Karen's yard, the pile of ash where her perfect world had crumbled. It had all been a game to her, but now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale, one who had gone too far, pushing a community to the brink, only to be consumed by her own greed. And as Will looked at the wreckage, he realized there was only one thing left to do. He picked up his phone. "It's time to post the last video," he muttered. The camera rolled, capturing the burnt-out remains of Karen's HOA reign and the quiet aftermath. The message was clear: don't mess with the bull.